Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 34th lecture of our lecture series. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literatures envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. Later in 2005, a new department called Comparative Indian Languages and Literatures was established, which still continues to carry research in Indian languages. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 took inspiration from this history, and it is a platform for sharing research interests and ideas. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Your remarkable skills will be a great addition to our team. We look forward to a mutually beneficial relationship with you. Thank you for joining us today. Now I would like to request our host, Aratrika Ganguly, to introduce the speaker. Aratrika ji.
Thank you, Suparna, for this lovely introduction. I welcome all our viewers and our participants, and a very warm welcome to our speaker of the day, Dr. Valerie Hannon Smitherman. Now I'll introduce our speaker. Dr. Valerie Hannon Smitherman received her PhD from the University of Bergen, Norway in 2016, where she specialized in Aeschylean tragedy and performance studies. Her PhD dissertation is entitled "Song and Community in the Oresteia: Contextualizing the Chorus of Erinyes." She also holds an MPhil in Classics from University College Oxford. Her areas of interest includes ancient Greek literature, Arabic language and literature, oral poetry, classics, comparative cultural studies, and historical comparative linguistics. Currently, she is working on a project regarding ancient Greek and Bedouin poetry traditions. She is also a member of the Honorary Society Phi Beta Kappa. I welcome Dr. Valerie. Valerie, thank you for joining us today. The floor is over to you now, and she will be talking on her topic for the day is weaving words, parallel poetic images in archaic Greece and Arabia. Valerie, over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Aratika, and thank you, Suparna, for the invitation to present here today. I really, really appreciate it. My talk, entitled Weaving Words, Parallel Poetic Images in Archaic Greece and Arabia, is an outline of research that I've been undertaking the past 3 years. I began after I submitted my PhD dissertation, really as a way to continue my exploration of song and community. I was actually researching traditions of poetry performed in community. That is, poetry that isn't just written down to be published in a book, which is then to be read quietly in a room by oneself. So poetry that is meant to be performed in front of others in a theatrical manner. And trying to see if I could locate a tradition of this performed poetry that was, well, had a descendant in the modern world. And in this way, through a series of very fortuitous online searches, I came across the work of Dr. Saad Suwayan, who is an emeritus professor of anthropology at King Saud University in Saudi Arabia, on Nabathi poetry. Nabathi poetry is the traditional oral poetry of the Bedouin people, and Dr. Suwayan has dedicated his professional life to its preservation and analysis. So before I begin, I would just like to say that even though these ideas are mine, they are not, if you like, my original ideas. I'm very much in debt to Dr. Saad Suayan and the other scholars mentioned in the bibliography included at the end of my presentation. A very long time ago, when I was an undergraduate studying Sanskrit, my Sanskrit professor told us that the process of scholarship could be neatly summed up in a Sanskrit term, parampara. So the chain of knowledge that's passed from teacher to student. And then when the student becomes a teacher, it is again passed along. And that is such a beautiful image, and it stuck with me throughout my studies. And so I really see myself as just another link in a larger chain of people undertaking this sort of comparative work. As you could tell from my introduction, I am not myself formally a comparatist. I am a classicist. And although one could argue that as classics encompasses the world of the ancient Greeks and Romans, it is by its nature comparative. There was a lot about comparative studies that I learned, particularly about newer theoretical approaches to comparative studies, since I've started sharing my research online. So if what I say is interesting to you today, you're more than welcome to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. My handles are on the slide there in front of you, and they should also be in the chat box in the description box. I regularly share readings of Nabathi poetry, as well as bits and pieces of insight and different things that I'm doing. So I would be delighted if you join me there and contribute to that discussion, because scholarship should never, ever happen in a vacuum. Okay, well, with that, I'll pause for a moment to get a sip of my Coke here, not product placement, and launch into the actual talk. Okay, so if we could switch to the next slide, please. Excellent. So this is the moment, if you like, when I had the idea that this was something I should pursue. I was watching a YouTube recording of a lecture that Dr. Saad Suayan gave at the New York University's Abu Dhabi campus all the way back on November 11th, 2013. Now, I saw this lecture some years later because on that particular day in 2013, I was in my thesis cave feverishly working on my dissertation and not thinking about new projects at all. So I came to this later on in 2016. There we are. He says, and I'll read from the slide, I'm going to claim that if we were to compare Nabathi poetry and Greek literature, Nabathi poetry would not come out the worse off than Greek literature if it were not for the sophisticated analytical tools which have been utilized throughout the ages to hammer out the best there is in Greek literature and to add to it luster, brilliance, and coherence. And maybe you've had a moment like this in your life. But as I sat there at home on my computer, I had a flash and I thought, well, he's exactly right. He's absolutely, exactly right. Now, as a classicist and as a student of classics, I interact with ancient texts, but I don't do so in the form in which they've come down to us, which is different inscriptions or pieces of papyrus. Indeed, as a scholar primarily of literature, what I do is I read edited editions of these texts. And one of the things that I learned from his talk, and that was subsequently borne out through my own travels in the Middle East, in Jordan, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia later on, is that much of this poetry, this Nabathi poetry, is, if it is published, simply published. So, for example, you'll have just a book of poems with maybe one or two vocabulary notes on words that are no longer in common use and wouldn't necessarily be immediately understood by a modern audience, that is, modern speakers of Arabic. So this really hit the nail on the head, because I thought to myself, well, where would I be if that were also the case with the literature that I studied? If, for example, when I looked at Aeschylus' Eumenides for my thesis, I simply got just the text in Greek, no notes on different traditions or different readings of the papyrus manuscripts, no glosses of difficult Aeschylean terms, because Aeschylus was notorious for coining new words which are both beautiful and quite difficult to understand, at least at first reading. Where would I be? How would I be able to do my work? Well, clearly the answer is I wouldn't have been able to do my work at all. And so as I continued to listen to Dr. Suwayan's lecture, where he, with a very broad brush, laid out several areas in which Nabathi poetry and Greek poetry parallel. For example, we have both in the Homeric poems, stories of great battles and heroism. And then we have in Nabathi poetry, similarly, stories of raids, heroes, and wars, and rival kings, much like Agamemnon and Achilles in the Iliad. We also have poetry that encompasses really all aspects of daily life, including the sort of poetry that I'm going to talk about today, which is women's love poetry. And the difference that Dr. Suwayan pointed out, which to me was so key, was how can we expect that a tradition without a robust team of scholars or way of scholarship behind it can be accessible to the next generation? Well, quite simply, we can't. And one of the things that I learned when I was working at King Faisal University in Saudi Arabia was that for this generation of Saudis, Nabathi poetry and this tradition of oral poetry is something quite foreign indeed. This isn't something that they can just pick up and read like anything because they happen to be native speakers of Arabic. This is a relic of a former time when Bedouin people were true nomads, when there was no unified state, when the language itself was quite different. So they can't be expected to meaningfully engage with these texts without any kind of editorial aid in the meantime. And then secondarily, and I think this was more Dr. Sawayan's point in the lecture, honestly, was that we find, I think, both in the Gulf itself and also in the larger context of Middle Eastern studies, that Nabathi poetry is really still on the margins. And one of the reasons for this is this idea that, there really just isn't much there. Of course, that's not really accurate, but apart from the outstanding work of Dr. Sawayan and a few other scholars, including Clive Holes, Lila Abul-Lugud, and Munira Al-Ghadir, there really aren't too many scholars, particularly scholars working in the West, that engage with this tradition. And so he's making the point that without this kind of robust engagement and without the aid of these critical tools, close reading and other philological approaches, we wouldn't have the luster, brilliance, and coherence, as he so deftly put it, that we associate with classical literature. It simply wouldn't be there. It's part of the scholarly labor in which we all participate. And so with this, I thought, well, here he is. He's convincingly noting that there are so many parallels between the ancient Greek poetic tradition and the Nabathi or Bedouin oral poetic tradition. Here I am, I'm a classicist. I'm looking for a new project. I know a little bit of Arabic. I can always learn more. Why don't I try it? And that's been my approach ever since then. No, I don't have any degrees in Arabic. Yes, I'm still studying. I hope I'm improving daily, weekly, yearly, but I don't have 2 PhDs. So I'm a classicist, and what I'm doing is I'm employing the tools that my background and my parampara, my tradition, has given me, and applying them to this Nabathi tradition, because I am persuaded that Dr. Sawayan was in fact correct, and what we see as the august literary tradition of the West is in large part a cultural production of scholarly labor. And indeed, if we make this a similar kind of investment in Nabathi poetry, we will find, I believe, the same luster, coherence, and brilliance, to use his phrase once again, because it just really is that good. Excuse me. So, when you begin a project, the biggest question, and in many ways the most important one, is where exactly do I begin? And indeed, the Nabathi tradition, like the ancient Greek tradition, is so rich and varied that there are many, many ways in which to approach it. So, how did I choose my way? What is it that I am doing? Well, after I read Dr. Sawayan's book on Nabathi poetry, conveniently titled Nabathi Poetry, the Oral Poetry of the Bedouin, I came across Munira Al-Ghadir's book, Desert Voices, in which she paid particular attention to the oral poetry of Bedouin women. Now, this got my attention immediately because women's poetry, really didn't get much of a mention in Dr. Suwayan's book. He was more concerned with the larger notion of the tradition and the main social functions of Nabathi poetry. So the way that it engaged with politics, the way that local rulers would use it to communicate with each other, or poets from different tribes would use it as a sort of way to one-up each other, or something like that. These were all sort of bigger picture ideas, which makes perfect sense for a survey of that kind. But Dr. Munira Al-Khatir, she focused her attention on the poetry of women. Now, when I corresponded with Dr. Suwayan, at first, when I was trying to find my way in my research, I asked him about women's poetry. And he said, well, its defining features are that it's very short and very emotionally charged, and it lacks the long, formalized introduction, or nasib, which characterizes most Nabathi poems. That's a section in which the poet gives a kind of explanation for the composition. So before he comes to his main point, if you like, or begins to set the scene, he says, well, this is the reason why I was overcome and decided to compose. I came across a place where my friends had camped many years ago, and I was overcome with emotion. Or I was ill, and I remembered better times with my family, or something like that. This is a usual approach for Nabathi poets. But for women, Dr. Suwayan noted, there is no nasib. It is simply just these short, charged glimpses into their emotional reality. And indeed, it is usually an emotional reality. These are generally love poems. They are not quite as diverse in topic, at least as far as I have read, as poetry composed by men, but perhaps this is to be expected because these women existed within patriarchal social structures that put very clear delineations on what they were allowed to do. And I will come back to that point later on. The first thing that struck me, though, both in Dr. Suwayan's description of women's poetry and also in Dr. Gadir's treatment of it in Desert Voices, which I heartily recommend. It's a comparative reading of this poetry, the first of its kind, and still really one of a kind in the discipline. And one of the things that really brought me into comparative studies and comparative approaches. So I can't recommend it highly enough. Was that the brevity and the emotional character of these poems reminded me of the poetry of Sappho. Now, let's see where I am in my presentation, because I just tend to talk and talk. Right, okay, so if we can move to slide 3, I have a slide on Sappho. For those of you who may not know, as far as we can tell, and records are not exactly crystal clear on this point, Sappho lived from about 650 BC to 570 BC, and, we're guessing here, wrote around 10,000 lines of poetry. She was called the 10th Muse in ancient times. Her poetry was celebrated and it was intentionally preserved, although unfortunately it comes down to us in the modern day as fragments. So only about 650 of these about 10,000 lines actually survive. Now, she's best known for her lyric poetry, that is, poetry that's composed to be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre. And she composed wedding songs and other works intended for communal performance. Now, in terms of performance in Sappho, there are still several interesting questions. For example, what kinds of performances were these? Now, the earliest modern opinions on this, at least from Western classicists, was that Sappho composed poetry and it was performed in a school-like setting. Now, we've moved away from that, but there's still the sense that Sappho composed for a particular female circle. While it's clear that her wedding songs, for example, would quite naturally be performed in mixed company, that is, in audiences that included both men and women, it does seem like some of her more emotionally charged love poetry or erotic poetry was probably performed in a more private setting. Now, by private, I don't mean our modern notion of private, where you're just telling your best friend something. Private can include, for example, a symposium, so a dinner, which is more like what I would consider public, but that's from my notion of private and public informed by modernity. But the idea is that perhaps her love poetry especially gives us a glimpse into a uniquely woman-centered world. So a world that isn't determined by patriarchal social structures and patriarchal conventions. This is an important point to which I shall return. Now, moving on to the next slide. A little bit about Nabathi poetry. As I said, it's the traditional oral poetry of the Bedouin. It originated in what is now Saudi Arabia, although there are Nabathi traditions in Jordan, Syria, and Western Iraq. So anywhere you find traditional or communities of traditionally nomadic, I should say, Bedouins, you will find, quite likely, a tradition of Nabathi poetry. The term Nabathi was first used in the 13th century. It refers to the broken Arabic spoken by the Bedouin and the Nabateans before them. So the idea is this is not the polished classical Arabic of courtly life. This is the strange, slightly unapproachable, possibly ungrammatical, although possibly, and quite probably indeed, much older language. So Ian makes, I think, a convincing argument that the Nabathi tradition is directly descended from Jachlia poetry. So Jachlia poetry, moving on to the next slide, refers to the poetry composed before the advent of Islam in 610 AD, and it's widely considered to be some of the finest poetry in Arabic. Now, if you put Jahiliya poetry into Google, you will likely come up with the Mu'allaqat, which refers to the hanging poems. These are poems that were exemplars of the finest of this poetic tradition. And they were collected in the 8th century, and the idea is they're hanging around the inside of the Kaaba. That's why they're called the hanging poems. And there's also the Mufadaliyat, which is Al-Mufaddal's anthology of poetry from this period. Oh, and as a linguistic note, Jachlia refers to the time of ignorance. So the idea is, before the coming of Islam, the Arabs were ignorant. And the term stuck. So my point here is that even though many of the Nabathi poems that have been collected, especially those that Al-Qadir analyzes in her work, many of them were collected in the modern era. They, in fact, most likely have ancient roots. Indeed, there's no way to tell quite how old they are, because in this collection, the main collection of Nabathi women's poetry, as far as I know, and in fact, if anyone out there in internet land knows better, please do send me a message on social media or bring it up in the question and answer time, because I would be grateful to learn more on this. But as far as I know, the main collection of women's poetry, Nabathi poetry composed by women, is that of Ibn Radas, which was collected in the modern times, I'd say in the mid-60s, I believe. And when he did this in his capacity as a school inspector in Saudi Arabia, and he had a personal interest in preserving the traditional culture of the Bedouin. And during that time, marked as it was by very rapid modernization and industrialization in the country, there was a great deal of concern, I would say, that the forcible settling of the Bedouin and other technological as well as cultural changes would erase a lot of the traditional cultures that defined the peoples of Saudi Arabia. So, as a result of this, he was motivated to go to different communities and elicit examples of women's oral poetry and record them. Now, as far as I've read, this was actually quite an adventurous undertaking on his part, because people were not really very happy, especially male representatives of different families and tribes were not happy to share these poems. They were considered very private, and they were, in some cases, considered downright scandalous. Indeed, Ibn Radas apparently received death threats when he was doing this work. So this will give you an idea of just how charged the whole situation was, as well as the poetry itself. Because of the charged and delicate nature of the poetry, we often know very little or almost nothing, or indeed nothing, about the poets themselves or what motivated them to compose the poem. Sometimes we have a little bit of a notion, but a lot of times we don't. So indeed, this contributes to their fragmentary nature. Now, it's not to say that they were all longer, and as in the case of Sapphic poetry, a lot of these lines were lost. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is, given the way in which they've come to us with the lack of context, it does remind one, and indeed engage with, the way that we as Western classicists engage with fragments. So, this is what inspired me to go down this road. I thought, well, what better way to demonstrate the richness of the Nabathi oral tradition than to pay particular attention to the poetry of women, which is so sadly marginalized, but then to bring it into a sort of dialogue with the fragments of Sappho. Because in both cases, we see these parallels. For example, all of this poetry was composed within a larger context of patriarchal social systems. So Sappho and her choruses of women, although they expressed these ideas in performance, I think it's fair to say, especially given what we know about the emphasis on modesty and purity in ancient Greek culture, that a lot of these ideas would not be as easily expressed in a sort of day-to-day context. That is to say, they are encoded in poetic speech. And indeed, we find the same phenomenon when we look at both Jachlia and Nabathi poetry composed by women. In this poetry, we find that these women engage with different ideas and express different issues that would, in daily contexts, be considered quite immodest and almost unspeakable in some cases. Yet poetry, the language of poetry, and the formality of poetry, as well as performance, allows them the freedom to express these ideas and get in touch with those elements of their lives and of themselves. So, with that, I'd like to move on to the next slide. Now, what I'm going to outline in the time that remains is I'm going to go through 3 different short examples of this poetry and just talk a little bit about one image that I think is, well, ties them all together quite well, is a very rich point of contact between these 3 texts and the 3 traditions that they represent. Now, my larger project is to investigate the language of desire. So images of desire, whether that be erotic desire or longing or loss, the language of desire and how it's communicated in images in Sappho, in Jachlia poetry composed by women, and finally in Nabathi poetry composed by women. There are different images associated with desire. In fact, it's a quite rich topic. I keep saying rich, but this whole world is just so sumptuous. It's like being invited into a treasure trove of language. I can't help but be repetitive because it's so beautiful. And one of the images that jumped out to me when I was going over these works on my own was the image of woven cloth. Weaving is cross-culturally associated with women. It's women's work in ancient Greece, as it would have been for the Bedouin, both of the Jachlia period and then later on in the modern Nabathi period. Weaving was a job for women. And so each of these examples contain references to cloth. But here, it's more than just cloth. It's an image of desire. It's an image of great emotional power. And it's an image that I think expresses far more than just, oh, look, here's a pretty thing. Here's a textile, likely made by a woman. So, without further ado, if we move on to the next slide, you'll see, and I hope you can read it from your vantage point out there on the internet, Sappho's fragment 101. Now, I'm going to read the English translation by the incomparable Martin West. So this is addressed to Aphrodite. We have that for context. Aphrodite is, of course, the goddess of love. So this already locates us within the realm of love and desire and passion. And the fragment reads, kerchiefs and crimson-dyed aprons that float with the breeze, sent from Phakeia, precious gifts. That's all. So we have this image, this brilliant yet fleeting image of these beautiful claws, precious gifts, sent from far away to Aphrodite. Are these just things? Well, it seems to me that they're hardly just things, that their beauty and their effervescence, they float with the breeze. Their beauty and their effervescence is an image of desire itself. It is a beautiful thing. It is a fleeting thing. It comes from Aphrodite and possibly from far away. But just all of the images that this conjures, really quite beautiful. So moving on to the next slide and our next example. Let me pull it up for myself here. We have an example from the Nabathi tradition. And here we have another item, another textile, but it's got a bit of a different context, as you will see. Now, as far as I have read, we don't have too much in the way of context for this poem in Ibn Radas's edition, but as you'll be able to tell when we read it, it really speaks for itself. So I will read the English translation, which is done by Munira Al-Ghadir in her book, Desert Voices. And she translates, "O beloved, I give you my veil in ransom for you, although its beads are lost. I remember them when we met together behind the camp. O beloved, my eyes are watching over you, like a herdsman watching his camels." So again, here we have the image of a textile, in this case, a veil. And it's clearly very valuable because she says, the speaker says, "I give you my veil in ransom for you." She's giving it to him in ransom for him. She would like him to come back. He's gone away. And then she adds, perhaps it's not quite as valuable as we think, although its beads are lost. What happened to the beads? I remember them when we met together behind the camp. So here we have an example of an image of a woven cloth, which is very valuable and also deeply, deeply significant. It's her veil, which, as Leila Abul-Lughod so rightly observes in her work Veiled Sentiments, where she explores the life, daily life and culture among the Awlad Ali tribe as they were moving from a nomadic existence to a more settled existence in the 20th century. She says that the veil is really a symbol of a woman's modesty. So we have here not just a beautiful thing, but something that is deeply significant to the speaker herself. It's a symbol of her modesty, and her honor. So she's offering up the most valuable thing she has in this society in ransom for her beloved. But then she says, the veil's beads are lost. And this idea of loss is, I think, at this point, quite clearly transgressive. It's not exactly clear what transpired when they met together behind the camp. But now the veil's beads are lost. It's lost some of its value. It still has some value. She's offering it up in ransom. We don't know where he's gone, but then she says, my eyes are watching over you like a herdsman watching his camels. Well, how does a herdsman watch his camels? Does he watch them sort of like, oh, well, where are my camels? Gosh, I haven't seen them in a little while. Maybe they'll turn up later. Of course not. In this culture, in this context, camels are the herdsman's livelihood. He not only breeds them in order to sell or trade them with other Bedouin, he also depends on them for his livelihood. And, if they're lost, his fortunes are lost. If they suffer, he suffers. If they die, oh gosh, well, he's in a bad spot, isn't he? So a herdsman does not watch his camels passively. He doesn't watch his camels because he doesn't have anything else to do. He watches his camels intently, knowing that his livelihood and his identity is wrapped up in this herd. And so this is the sense, I think, that the speaker is bringing to the situation. She's watching her beloved with that kind of intensity, knowing that a great deal of herself is wrapped up in their love and in him as a person. And so there's so much there. We have, in this case, the contrast between the beautiful and valuable textile, but also the idea that there's some damage done to the textile, and then we can infer from that there is some issue with what she has done. Perhaps she fears that there has been damage done to her reputation. Perhaps there has actually been damage done to her reputation. And now she is watching her beloved with that kind of intensity because of this event that's transpired. So the intensity of this and the way in which the image of the textile brings together these ideas of desire and modesty and transgression and liminality to a certain extent, to me is just astonishingly rich. And to do so in so few words, it's absolutely beautiful. Well, you can tell I'm in love with this. I should be in love with this because right now I do it purely out of love. It is a passion project. Although I am currently applying for and always seeking more opportunities for funding. So if anybody can think of any opportunities for funding, sponsorship, do please let me know on social media or put them in the chat, because I'm quite happy to receive news of possible funding opportunities. Now, getting back to my presentation, if we could move to the next slide. Finally, we have an example from the Jachlia period. For this poem, we know the poet's name, Ishraqat al-Muharibiyya, and that's all we know about her, according to the edition in which I found this, which is Classical Poems by Arab Women, Bilingual Anthology by Abdullah al-Udari. And he says, all we know about her is her name. Nothing else is known. And here we have the poem. I will read al-Udari's translation. All lovers wear my cast-off clothes and jewels, and gulp down my overspilt drink. I have raced with lovers at love's racetrack, and beaten them all at my own pace. So here we've come back to the image of the textile as being purely about the beautiful, overwhelming, rich sense of desire. There's no transgression here, no hint of tension or any other sort of issue as we had in the Nabathi example. This speaker is speaking from a place of pride and confidence. And she's being very direct. All lovers wear my cast-off clothes and jewels, and gulp down my overspilt drink. So if you have ever been in love, you are enjoying what this woman has left behind her. She is so enriched by the beauty of love and by the richness of her desire, which is metaphorically expressed through the image of just absolutely sumptuous attire, cast off clothes and jewels. And we can just imagine, you know, like a princess or a queen at a banquet who's just decided, well, would I like to wear the rubies or the diamonds? Would I like to wear the silk or the taffeta? She's spoiled for choice, and so she has all these beautiful cast-offs, and anyone else who falls in love is wearing those. Then she says, I have raced with lovers at love's racetrack and beaten them all at my own pace. And I'd like to take a moment to just think about the kind of confidence that expresses. Especially here in the West, and I'm speaking from the United States at the moment, where the global pandemic has decreed that I should stay for the foreseeable future. We have this stereotypical notion of Arab women as meek and diminished by the social structures in which they live. But here we have a poet who speaks for herself, or at least a speaker in the poem, to be more correct, who says, I have raced with lovers at love's racetrack and beaten them all at my own pace. Wow. Now, I think it's important to note that, again, this is from the Jachlia period, so before the coming of Islam, and that might have something to do with it. But indeed, there are examples which I don't have time to cover today, but there are other examples of very confident, self-assured statements about love and desire from the Nabathi tradition. So since the coming of Islam, so I wouldn't necessarily say that it's only because this is a Jachlia poem that the speaker can be so confident when she speaks of love. I wouldn't necessarily say that at all. I've included this in the presentation to point out how I think this dovetails quite neatly with Sappho fragment 101. Although the textiles mentioned in that fragment are understood to be gifts to the goddess Aphrodite, so perhaps a bit more formal. We have a kind of parallel situation here where the speaker says, I have embraced love and desire, romantic love and desire, so fully. I am so enriched by it that anyone else who loves is enjoying my cast-offs, my overspilt drink, my cast-off clothes and jewels. So these are sort of parallel gifts to love, if you like. She has so much that, you know, it's trailing behind her. And to elaborate on this idea of just her absolute richness and the confidence that comes with it, she then brings in the image of the racetrack. Now, there is an image of a racetrack as sort of a footnote. Classicists love footnotes, so excuse me while I indulge myself. There is an image of the racetrack in Ovid's Art of Love, but he's talking about sort of how to first of all, there's a scene where he says that going to the races is a perfect way to strike up a conversation with a girl, because you can get close to her and offer to dust off her garment for her or something like that and strike up a conversation that way. And he also uses the image of the racetrack in a more direct way to refer to sexual activity. So we have that as a parallel to the tradition of Latin love poetry, which is not the main point of this presentation, but to go back to Dr. Soyan's point of just how rich the Nabathi tradition is and how all we really need is to invest the kind of scholarly capital that we have in the Western classical tradition for hundreds of years to hammer it out. There's so much there. There's so much there. I mean, it was hard for me to narrow down to a specific topic. And that's one of the reasons why I have so much fun sharing about my research on social media, because if something doesn't fit in to my particular focus on women's poetry or images of desire, as expressed by women, I can just post about it and say, oh, look, here's this fun thing. I'll come back to it later, because it really is that astonishing a tradition. It's amazing. It's really amazing. So that was my footnote to myself. My point by way of a conclusion, I think all I would say is that these are just 3 poems. We have one fragment of Sappho, one poem from the Nabathi tradition, and one poem from the Jachlia period. Just 3, just one image, the image of the woven textile. And it's transformed from something that's created by women as part of their social responsibilities, their daily labors, into an image of the richness and the joy associated with romantic love and desire. But also, in the Nabathi example, we have a little bit of a note of tension there, right, with the veil that's lost its beads. They were there, she remembers them when she met her beloved behind the camp, but now they're lost. So this one image is employed cross-culturally to encode these different elements of women's desire. The sheer joy of it, the beauty of it, its association with love, lovers, and in Sappho, the goddess of love herself. These kerchiefs are a gift, it seems, to Aphrodite. But also, in the Nabathi example, we have a little bit of a note of what might happen to a woman in that kind of patriarchal social structure when she indulges in this image, when she indulges in desire. Does it always end well? It's not clear, because of course, what's happened to the speaker in the Nabathi poem? We don't know. We know that her veil has lost its beads. We know that she watches her beloved intensely. We know that she waits for him. We don't know anything else. So it's not clear. It's got that kind of ambiguity that I'm so used to finding in Greek tragedy. But just this one example of these 3 poems, this one image, I think illustrates quite well the richness of the Nabathi tradition, the Jachlia tradition, the unique emotional power of poetry composed by women, both in the Jachlia period and later in the Nabathi tradition, but also the kind of really interesting dialogues that we can foster when we compare works like these and images like these across traditions. I think I need to say, because I haven't said it quite yet, that when I say I'm comparing these traditions, it isn't in the sense that I think one is greater than and one is less than, for example. I don't. I take comparison in the sense of Emily Sun, or yes, in her upcoming work, I've read the advance praise for it, and I hope that I understand these ideas. One of my good friends, who's a comparatist, has guided me through it, and I hope that I do. So Emily Sun, in her upcoming work, which I believe is in the bibliography, let's see, should be. I have to check my own. Oh my goodness, it's not. Well, many apologies for that. I don't know how that happened. But Emily Sun isn't in my bibliography slide. So apologies for that. But if you're interested, you can Google her. It's her forthcoming work on the horizons of global literature, or you can send me a message on social media, or if you give me a moment after I finish here, I can pull it up in another browser tab and give you the link in the chat box, because that was a massive oversight. She has this idea. What she does is she compares reactions to modernity in 19th century British literature and 20th century Chinese literature. And she's doing this with the aim of creating a dialogue between these texts. Not to say that one is greater than or less than, and not to say that they have any intrinsic or genetic relationship to each other. It's clear that they do not. But that because they both address a larger concept or context, in her case, the coming of modernity. In my case, we have women encoding their expressions of desire, expressions that culturally, in a sort of day-to-day context in a patriarchal society, women would not be as free to express. I think it's fair to say. We can create this dialogue that is mutually illuminating. So by taking a look at Sappho, we can perhaps enrich our understanding of the Nabathi and Jachlia traditions, and so vice versa. By taking a look at the Nabathi and Jachlia traditions and how they dialogue with and engage with images similar to those found in the works of Sappho, we can see, as Dr. Soyan said in his lecture in 2013, how both of these traditions share many parallels and indeed enjoy the same kind of luster and brilliance. And it's really just up to us to do the scholarly work to make that more evident. Thank you very much for your time. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie. Thank you for this illuminating and this very amazing lecture. Like Sappho is a very favorite poet of mine. So like I was like kind of lost in that world when you were talking. It was such a good lecture. Should we move to the question and answer the comment session?
Oh, yes, please.
Yes, definitely. Yes, actually, Lisa is saying. Actually, I was going to say that this as well. I was going to comment as well that this tradition seems like a poetry of women to men. Sorry, there's. Can I just read from? Yeah, Sapphic poetry is female to female. The two sound different in some ways. Actually, also what I have read or what I know that Sappho used to write poems to her like maybe students or companions, and that's how she used to live in the island of Lesbos, right? So that's how the term lesbian came into being. So it's like maybe the relationship was not homosexual, or maybe it was just of affection, we don't know that, but it's very much yes, woman to woman centered. So how do you think that relates in the other two traditions you're talking about?
These are really good questions, so thank you both. I would say, first of all, this is perhaps me not being very clear. Um, I think we can see from the work of Lila Abu Lughod in Veiled Sentiments, where she lives or catalogues her experiences living with the Aulad Ali tribe in the 20th century, mid 20th century, and she discovers how the women in the family that she joined used poetry. Really, we find that this poetry, the Kinawa, is mainly performed just in small groups of women. And I think for the Nabathi tradition, what we can say clearly, because of course we don't have a lot of good evidence, or at least I haven't found a lot of good evidence for performance context in that tradition. But I think just the way that Ibn Radas was treated when he sought to record examples of this tradition in his book in sort of the mid 20th century, he got death threats, right? So the idea was that this was poetry meant for a select audience. And there are cases of women's Nabathi poetry being shared with men, but they're always men, at least as far as we can tell, that are part of the poet's immediate family. So I think it is very much sort of a woman-to-woman tradition. With the Jachlia poetry, Sad Suyan suggests that it is the direct ancestor of Nabathi poetry. It's really not clear what the performance context was at all. But my working assumption is that it's not fundamentally different from that of Nabathi poetry, and the Ghina was recorded, by Lila Abu Lughod. So I think that all of these traditions are primarily composed by women for women. There are specific examples where men would be involved, like we have wedding songs from Sappho, so too we have wedding songs in the Aulad Ali that were composed by women. These would be naturally performed in mixed company. But to more to the point, the poems that Abu Lughod records in her work that regarded love and loss and romantic feelings toward a husband or a beloved were not really meant to be shared widely at all. In fact, she says that it was very difficult for her to get permission from some of these ladies to record them. right? So that she could listen to the recordings and then transcribe them and include them in her book. These ladies were very nervous about that because they thought, well, if this goes on a tape, then I don't know who's going to hear it. And she says that there were examples of times when she heard a short poem of Yanawa and she was interested in it, wanted to remember it, wanted to record it, and was told, just no, I'm not going to recite that again. That's not for the box, not for the recording. So I hope that answers the question. Performance context isn't clear, but I think it is primarily a woman-centered context in both Sappho and these different Arabic language traditions.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for your answer. We have some more comments, I guess. Anne Nash is saying, insightful and fascinating. Well, the comparisons are thought provoking. I think there are many more comments and questions. I hope there are. Yes, there is a question by Suparna. Was Nabathi poetry composed orally? Is there a performance tradition associated? Pardon me for if you have already mentioned.
These are
Valerie, you
very,
want to comment here?
yes, these are very good questions, and I mentioned it very briefly, but it deserves more attention. So thank you very much, Suparna, for bringing this up. Nabathi poetry was indeed originally composed orally, and in fact, traditionally speaking, the Nabathi poet was illiterate. So these poems were orally composed and then memorized by others to be disseminated more widely among different groups of Bedouin. So yes, these are oral performances. There is a performance tradition associated with Nabathi poetry. It depends on the poem itself, but they would be recited in different tribal gatherings, in different contexts, and things like that. Now, if we look at the modern age specifically, we find that in the UAE, there has been a specific effort to revitalize this tradition. The late Sheikh Zayed of Abu Dhabi was very concerned with cultural heritage and the preservation of his cultural heritage. Again, he embraced modernity, but he also wished to preserve elements of Bedouin culture that he felt might well be erased by rapid industrialization. So one of the things that he did was put aside government money and dedicate a certain amount of government care and attention to the preservation of culture and heritage. This led to the creation of Al-Shar Al-Milyon, which is a show that is broadcast in Abu Dhabi and worldwide online. It's lots of fun if you know a little bit of Arabic, and it's called A Poet in a Million in English. And what it is it's sort of like an X Factor or American Idol competition, but for Nabathi poets. That is for poets from around the Arabic-speaking world, usually the Gulf, although I believe there was a contestant once who, although he was part of that ethnic heritage, he actually came from Australia. And these Nabathi poets compose poetry and perform it as part of this program. Now, they, as modern poets, are, of course, quite literate, and they do generally write their poems down and then read from them in performance. Although this doesn't always happen, it really depends on the individual poet. Performer, I have seen examples of reading from a text, and in different elements of the show, they have kind of a behind the scenes section where we see them kind of preparing for the show or talking about poetic inspiration, and there's always a scene of the poet sitting, thinking intently, leaning over a pad of paper and writing away, which is, I think, a very Western image, ultimately, of poetic composition. But there you are. Yes, originally it was an oral tradition, although it's not purely an oral tradition now. This oral tradition, another footnote, interestingly enough, was preserved all the way up until the late 80s. On my Instagram page right now, I'm doing a Saturday series where I read passages from Marcel Kupacek's edition of ad-Dindan's poetry. And Abdullah ad-Dindan, that was not his family name. It's sort of a nickname that means the one who rhymes, the one who sings, the one who hums to himself. That's how closely associated he was with his poetic gift. He lived in the Najd Desert in central Saudi Arabia. And Marcel Kupacek, who was at that time the Dutch ambassador to Saudi Arabia, living in Riyadh, he met him and stayed with him in his desert camp for a period of time, and he recorded Dindan orally performing his poetry. So this was the late 80s, we'll say. And the book was published, I believe, in 1992. But Dindan was, at that point, an old man, and he was completely illiterate. So he composed this poetry orally, he memorized it, he recited it, he performed it for his fellow tribesmen and also for Kupacek himself. And there are audio recordings of excerpts of these recordings, at least on Brill's website, which I occasionally share on Twitter, because I also post the recordings of my readings on Twitter, and I always like to compare myself to Dindan and give my audience the same opportunity. So this tradition of oral poetry and performance was alive, at least in the figure of Dindan, all the way up until the 1980s. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I don't know what's happened.
Yeah, sorry. I've muted myself. Yeah, so there's another comment that Nabathi poetry was used to declare war, seek peace, since Bedouin is war-prone community. Valerie, you want to comment on that? Do you think this poem is more concerned about celebrations of war and conflict
There
instead
is
of love?
another part of the question. Please read that out.
Yeah,
Do you
no.
think this poem is more concerned about
Yeah, I just read
celebrations of
that out.
war
Yeah.
and conflict instead of love?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think the best answer I have to that is that what we have is largely a question, as it is in classics, of what our editors or compilers show us. So Saad Suwayan, who focuses a great deal on the larger cultural context and cultural function of Nabathi poetry in his work, as he's coming at it from an anthropological perspective, he does focus, to some degree at least, on war poetry. However, if we look at Marcel Kupacek's volume of Dindan's poetry, we find indeed a great number of love poems. Dindan was a hopeless romantic. I'm actually working my way through one of his love poems at the moment on my Instagram page in that reading series, which is also posted on Twitter. So I don't think that we can say that it was mainly focused on love or war or celebrations to the exclusion of anything else. I think instead we should say that what we have of this tradition really encompasses all of the great moments of human life. So the experience of love, the experience of conflict. We also have a lot of teasing and boasting in Nabathi poetry, where different poets from different groups will say, well, so-and-so says you're a good poet, but I heard something from you, and you know what? I don't think that rhymes, or I don't think that meter's good. Here, I'm going to redo it. Like, if anybody's seen the movie Amadeus, there's a scene in the movie Amadeus where the court composer Salieri writes a short march to honor the composer Mozart as he comes to visit the court of the emperor. And Salieri, we see in the movie, the night before, he's agonizing over this composition, and he isn't really sure how to end it. He comes up with an ending. He says a prayer. He's thankful for the inspiration. He goes to bed. And he comes to this court gathering the next day. And the emperor says, "Oh, Herr Mozart, Salieri has prepared this for you in your honor." So Salieri sits down in the movie and he plays this on the harpsichord. And Mozart is smiling, he's polite. He says, "Oh, thank you." But then he says, "Let's play that again." It doesn't really work, does it? The ending of the piece, that is. And then Mozart plays this short piece of music entirely from memory, based off one hearing, and then he reworks the ending into something actually quite beautiful and clever and much better than what Salieri had. And we see this kind of playful one-upmanship in Nabathi poetry as well. So these poets just enjoying their craft for its own sake. We see all kinds of Nabathi poetry.
So, do you have any more questions or comments? Or otherwise, I have some questions. I guess I'll just ask my questions then. Valerie, if Sappho's poems are set on maybe the harp or the lyre, what instrument does this Nabathi tradition uses?
That's a very good question. As far as I know, as far as I've seen and read, there really isn't much in the way of musical accompaniment to Nabathi poetry. So it is sometimes chanted, sometimes sung. There's a little bit of a melody to it. In fact, I mentioned Leila Abul-Lughud's work earlier, and the term that the Awlad Ali used to refer to their poetry is ghinawa, and that comes from the Arabic word to sing, ghanid. So there is this notion of singing, but not really so much of musical accompaniment. I think in some cases there are some kinds of poems that might be accompanied by drums. In the larger Gulf tradition, we have praise poetry, and sometimes praise poetry is incorporated into rituals that include dancing and the display of arms and the joyful shooting of guns into the air and that kind of thing. But we don't have a specific. Actually, wait a minute. We do have there's one instrument which is a stringed instrument. I'm trying to remember what it's called, and I can't. But there's a stringed instrument that's sort of like it's small to medium sized. It's like a violin, but it's held vertically, and it's played with a bow. And I'm very sorry, I don't remember the name of it in Arabic right now, but I have seen one example on YouTube where a poet, or at least a Bedou in Wadi Rum in Jordan, recited some poetry and played a few notes on that. But I don't specifically recall much discussion of musical accompaniment, although that's a very good question and I should look into that further. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have read about Sappho. I wrote about Sappho, but I really had not much no idea about the Nabathi poems or the Jallia poems. Like, can you suggest us, like, who are very new to this kind of poems, like how should we start reading the Nabathi poems, or any books or any suggestion on that?
Okay,
Kind of
so
beginners, beginners guide to Nabathi tradition, maybe.
Well, okay. If you want a good overview in English
Yeah,
of the
that would be
Nabathi
great.
tradition, that's Dr. Saad Suwayan's book, Nabathi Poetry. I downloaded a digital copy from his website some years ago. He's very generous, and he uploads most of his books to his website for free distribution and download. His website is sadsuwayan.com. And I think I can put it in the chat here, I think.
Yeah.
But let's see. Let me make sure I have the address correct. Because it might have changed. Yikes, I am getting an error on this page. I have it saved in my Google Keep. Sorry, I've got to pull this up because redirected to something a bit strange. Anyway, of course, it's been reprinted several times, so if you would like to buy the book...
You can share it later with me. I will forward.
Yeah. Suparna can forward here, or Suparna can put it in the chat box
I'm
later
not
on.
sure. It might be my browser, but when I tried to pull up his website, I got one of those Flash player error issue messages.
It's okay. It's okay. You can send it later.
But that is a very good overview of his the Nabathi tradition. Another good introduction is the work I mentioned by Munira Al-Ghadir, Desert Voices. That was published in 2009, and it was written for, well, at least in the perspective of comparative literature. So maybe that would be even more approachable to your audience. She translates everything into English as well. So if you don't read Arabic, that's not a problem. Her focus is, of course, the oral poetry of women, whereas Dr. Suwayan's is more general. But I would recommend, first of all, those two books.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll just check it out as well, and our viewers can also check it out if they want to read Nabathi poem. I'm sure they will want to after hearing this wonderful lecture. And in Nabathi poems, there is one example you shared. I could see the metaphor of the landscape, the deserts, everything related to the deserts present. And one thing I want to know, in the Greek tradition, if we, I'm not talking about Sappho, but in the Greek lyric tradition, there is a concept of the like in the in the poetry, like the person is going the, I mean, it's the poet's voice, some sort of lyric poetry, the person is going into a trance, like one character is always mentioned, the prophetess of Apollo at the temple of Delphi. So is there a kind of similar thing that can we can find in the Nabathi tradition, going into a trance or something like that?
Ooh, well, that's a really interesting question. Um, in a sense, yes, actually. And this is something that I am looking forward to investigating further in the future. The Nabathi poet, remember, perhaps, if our memories can stretch back nearly 2 hours, gosh, I've talked a lot. When I said that poems composed by men are marked by a longer introduction section, we find, especially in the poetry of Dindan that I'm looking at at the moment, but this is a general theme, that poets often incorporate in these introductions a description of their emotional state right before they came to compose the poem they're about to perform. And for Dindan, this is just an overwhelming sense that, these emotions, these feelings, whether they be of love, of loss, of nostalgia, of this desire to pray for rain. There are several poems where he prays for rain, which, as you can imagine, would be a fairly regularly occurring activity for a nomadic Bedouin camel herder. This idea of being overcome is absolutely present and discussed in these poems. It's very personal, it's very immediate, it's very emotional, and it's always coupled with the need to isolate oneself, to go to a high place, a hilltop or a mountaintop, and isolate himself from the rest of society, and then to let these emotions come out in poetic composition and performance. And the process of this is so intense that it is actually, poetic composition is associated with possession by jinn. If we know what jinn are the creatures that Allah created from smokeless fire. In the West, we might translate them as sort of demons, but they're not really demons. They're these otherworldly entities that can take over the human mind or spirit and cause the person to do whatever the jinn might want. So sometimes the jinn wants a person to behave irrationally as a punishment or some other reason, or sometimes the jinn wants the person to do something for it. But these emotions are so intense that they are associated with this idea of otherworldly possession, even. So yes, absolutely. And we find in Greek literature the idea of being overtaken is similarly, this immediate experience. Now, what comes to mind from my work is, of course, the very beginning of Eumenides, where we have the prophecy of the Pythia, but I suppose that's not a very good example, because indeed the prophecy of the Pythia in Eumenides is perhaps the calmest element of the entire play. But the short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. That is a yet another area where we find these very interesting and compelling parallels.
And like that is so much related to what in the South Asia we have the Bhakti and Sufi tradition. We have this concept of fana, no, becoming one with the Paramatman, with God and everything. It's so related. Everything is so related. It's amazing. So, if you have any other question or comments, or we can go towards concluding the session. Do you have any questions or comments, or anyone want to write anything in the chat box? They can write now. Or Pratim, if there is any question or comment, you can show. Otherwise, we can move towards concluding the session.
Okay, just as a note, I have the
Yeah,
link to the work I referenced, the forthcoming work by
yeah,
Emily
please share.
Sun.
Yeah,
So I'm just putting that in the chat there.
yeah. Pratim, can you just put it in the YouTube chat box, maybe? Thank you, Valerie. Thank you for this.
I didn't want to forget that. And I'm sorry about Sad Suyan's website. I seem to have an issue there. But if anybody would is interested in what I've been talking about or would like further information on resources or copies of articles or other texts have that I've found that have been freely distributed online and whose authors are happy to have them distributed further online, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me on social media. I'll be happy to send you what I have.
Yeah, I'll just let the viewers know your Twitter handle is Dr. VH Smitherman.
Yes.
At the rate Dr. V capital H S Mitherman.
Yes.
Dr. Valerie, maybe you can search Dr. Valerie. And your Instagram ID is this is Dr. Valerie.
Yes, and that's no capitals, no spaces, and
No
hopefully
cap, no
easier to
spaces.
remember.
Yes.
I
And like you have got a wonderful display picture with a very cute hat. So like I think anyone can find that. Your viewers sent. And Valerie, if you want to maybe share your mail IG with the viewers, you can then.
okay. Well, if you would like to reach me by email, you're welcome to email me at bhsmitherman, SMITHERMAN, at gmail.com. No capitals, no spaces. And I can put that in the chat box as well.
Thank you. I don't know about the viewers, but I think I will reach try to reach.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
part of this, part of my point in doing this and my mission in going on social media in the first place, because when I was a graduate student, I really didn't use social media much at all. I mean, I had a Facebook account like everybody else, but I really only used it to chat with friends. Um, Taking my work online has been such a rewarding experience, and I want to keep this idea of the virtual colloquium going, especially given the world situation right
Pandemic
now. We're
situation.
we're
Yeah.
not necessarily able to do the traveling that we would like, or to go to conferences as we intended. But I think, we can try to build other networks and work with what we've got. And my specific presentation today was even inspired by chats I've had with friends like Suparna and others on Instagram. So absolutely reach out to me. I would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Valerie. And like before concluding, I just like to ask you that this traditional poetry of, I mean, this oral tradition from Sappho, Nabathi, Jallia, how think you can like, is there any elements, any traces we can find in modern Greek poetry, modern Arabic poetry, the poetry of Central Asia? Is there any remnants present now?
Well, as I said, there is a modern Nabathi tradition. Um, it's different. The poets are literate now, and sometimes they go on TV, like in Poet in a Million, Al-Shar al-Milyon. But as far as modern Greek poetry, I don't know. I do know the poetry of Cavafy. Who doesn't know Cavafy? And if you don't know Cavafy, you should. It's just absolutely astonishingly good. But I'm not really very familiar with modern Greek poetry in general outside of Cavafy. So, or Cavafy, I'm tripping over my words today. But I'm not sure. I've been focusing on the parallels that I outlined in this presentation, but again, that's part of the adventure of this kind of comparative work. It goes on and on. So if you're working on something from another part of the world or another tradition that I haven't mentioned, and you have been sitting here and had a moment like I had when I watched Dr. Suyan's lecture on YouTube, absolutely get in touch with me because I'd love to hear about it.
I think we have one last question. Yeah. Why is Arabic or Bedouin poetry not more known?
Well, thank you, Lisa. That's an excellent question. And that's something that Dr. Suyan has lamented for years. Why isn't this better known? I think, at least my understanding from his work, is that this comes down to a question of prejudice, really. When we look at the context in the Gulf, Bedouin poetry and Bedouin people are stereotyped as backward and ignorant. Even in earlier histories, so for example, going back to the histories of Arabia and the advent of Islam, the Bedouin were known for their uncouth ways of behavior, their rough manners, their unkempt dress. There was a lot of prejudice against the Bedouin from city dwellers who considered themselves to be just absolutely the pinnacle of everything, much as city dwellers in our modern age do as well when they think about rural people. At least I think this is true in many places. So there's that dynamic going on, first of all. And then secondly, because of this, I think, it doesn't really get a lot of academic attention. A parallel might be, for an American context anyway, would be, say, for example, I wanted to do an academic survey, a comparative survey in an academic context of the images of the beloved in bluegrass songs or, Appalachian ballads of West Virginia. I think a lot of Americans would hear that and just, laugh and say, well, is that really worth your time? Is that really worth an academic study? Aren't these things just, the bits and pieces of whatever Hicks used to entertain themselves, right? We don't really need to spend time on that. It's not worth our time. That's the kind of reaction that work on Nabathi poetry has received in the past in the Gulf region. Now, this isn't universally true, and it's not always true now either. And I think efforts like those of Sheikh Zayed in Abu Dhabi as well as other sort of general history and culture preservation efforts in the Gulf have sort of helped to tone this down a bit, but there still really is this idea that this kind of poetry is a relic of a backward time. So if you're dealing with that degree of prejudice in the country of origin, then it becomes a question of what's going to come further out, for example, to other countries and be translated and be accessible to scholars who don't necessarily have the language capabilities to engage with it in Arabic. So it really is an uphill battle. And that's a big part of the reason why I decided to undertake this work, because I listened to that lecture and I was convinced that Dr. Suyan was right, and I wanted to do my part to help. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Valerie. I don't think we have any more questions or comments. But anyways, it has been a wonderful and splendid evening. It has been such a nice lecture, and you just sparked interest among us about new genres like the Nabathi and the Jachlia. And like I'd like to formally conclude. And Shupana, you want to add something?
I would like to thank Dr. Valerie for joining our lecture, and I guess our listeners got to know many things from you. Thank you for joining all our participants and our beloved speaker. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, everyone in the audience, and Aratika and Suparna. Thank you for your kind invitation to share my research with you. I had a lovely morning, in my case, on the other side of the world. And I'm not a morning person, so that's saying something. Thank you
So
very
that
much.
means a lot that you took the effort
Yes.
to wake up for us.
I love poetry. What can I say?
And we had a lovely poetic evening. It was really poetic.
Yeah.
And such a nice evening we had with you. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to all our viewers for watching our lecture on YouTube today. And our next lecture, we'll declare about our next lecture about in our schedule. In
This
our
tomorrow.
this
This
tomorrow,
tomorrow.
yes. On our, you can get more updates on our social media handles on our platforms like Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, everywhere. And thank you, everyone, once again. Thank you, Dr. Valerie. A very good night to everyone, and a very good morning to Valerie. Thank you.